All right. Well, good morning, I think. Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be here with you today, albeit in two-dimensional space. Thanks a lot for joining me. It's especially great to see so many familiar faces. I'm really looking forward to catching up with every one of you in person when I visit Ithaca in graduation in May. Now, before I begin, I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to my wonderful dissertation committee, Fuad Maki, Phil McMichael, Laurie Leonard, and Christophe Jaffrelot, for guiding me through this journey. I also want to thank Engage Cornell South Asia Program and the Henry Luce Foundation for supporting this research along the way. So I'm really excited to share some of the work that has occupied me over the past few years. And I hope to take you on a journey through one of the most transformative periods, I think, in contemporary India's political history. So let me take you back to 2014. After decades of coalition governments and intense electoral competition, India witnessed a seismic shift. The Hindu nationalist BJP secured an unprecedented, clear parliamentary majority, and Narendra Modi, a lifelong member of the militant Hindu right, became prime minister. This wasn't merely a change in leadership. It marked a fundamental reconfiguration of how power operates in India, particularly in how violence functions in constituting hegemony. Consider the bulldozer, which has become emblematic of Modi's rule. Over the last couple of years, municipal bodies across India have increasingly deployed bulldozers to raze Muslim properties, using the pretext of removing illegal encroachments while specifically targeting Muslim activists. What appears on the surface as localized instances of development-induced displacement actually represents a new form of state-sponsored political violence. The Hindu right's historical reliance on communal riots has been largely replaced by these formally legal and economic practices as the primary means of Muslim subordination and segregation. This transformation, I think, reveals a crucial blind spot in our scholarship. We've typically analyzed physical violence like riots and lynchings separately from economic and legal forms of marginalization, things like discriminatory laws, land markets, and development-induced displacement. This analytical separation reinforces a liberal assumption that nationalism and neoliberalism and their respective violences operate independently. But I think this framework is no longer tenable. When municipal corporations across India use market-based imperatives to demolish Muslim homes, we must recognize these actions as integral to the Hindu right's broader hegemonic project. This shift in how violence operates forces us to rethink political resistance itself. Can we really understand resistance by examining it only in relation to specific forms of violence, whether as anti-communal protests, anti-displacement movements, or legal challenges? As violence morphs from overt attacks to legally sanctioned demolitions to development projects, the nature of political possibility itself transforms. Those facing both physical violence and economic displacement, in air quotes, increasingly recognize they're confronting themselves, not isolated incidents, but a coordinated project that operates through both spectacular acts and structural transformation. The critical question becomes, how do people build collective responses to violence that can constantly shift its form? I analyze this historical moment through what I call the hegemony of communal capitalism. Building on insights from racial capitalism debates, which emphasize how capitalist social relations require and thrive on the violent reproduction of difference, I explore how such categories manifest materially in India's current conjuncture. However, where racial capitalism ultimately reduces violence to serving capital accumulation in the end, communal capitalism has a different emphasis. It shows how hegemonic logics can make productive the use of capital's violences to advance nationalist projects. This matters because it transforms how we understand violence in post-colonial states. Traditionally, following Gramsci, scholars saw violence as peripheral to hegemony, the armor of coercion, so to speak, backing up consent production through the realm of culture. But the Hindu right uses violence productively within culture itself. Since its inception, it has worked to transform India into a Hindu Rashtra or Hindu nation by mobilizing lower caste and working class Hindus to support what is essentially an elite project. They accomplished this through what Jacques Ellul calls the plebeianization of their support base. By orchestrating Hindu-Muslim riots, they create a monolithic Hindu identity defined against a Muslim other. Participation in collective violence allows subordinated Hindu groups to externalize feelings of inferiority while obscuring how the Hindu right itself perpetuates this very subordination. Ahmedabad, where I conducted my research, is widely considered the laboratory where the Hindu right perfected the strategic use of violence. While scholars like Varshney and Brass have shown how riots translate into electoral success, I argue that the implications run deeper. Violence, functioning as an antipode to power, entrenches identity categories while foreclosing opportunities for their renegotiation. But there's a critical duality here. While violence produces meaning and cements identity on the terrain of common sense, its exposure can reveal cracks in hegemonic formations. When violence becomes too naked, too visible, it can undermine the power it seeks to enforce. The 2024 elections in India demonstrated this. In states where bulldozer politics, where opposition parties successfully built cross-community alliances against displacement and economic precarity. This inherent risk, I think, explains Modi's or the Hindu right's key innovation. As a bottom-up movement, the Hindu right could effectively use overt violence because it operated primarily in the realm of culture. But state power made violence more visible and risky. Modi's solution was to sublimate riot violence into the economico-juridical violence of development. The violence remained productive in reshaping social relations, but now wore the mask of progress and modernization. It's when this mask slips, as with bulldozer politics, that the hegemonic project becomes vulnerable to challenge. Now, the logic of communal capitalism, and particularly the sublimation of violence into development, found its fullest expression in Modi's Gujarat, which has served both as a model of development and a laboratory of Hindutva. Ahmedabad, Gujarat's economic and de facto political capital, has been a historical stronghold of the Hindu right since its inception, where the organization rose to power through the strategic orchestration of riot violence. Through the mid to late 20th century, Ahmedabad witnessed what Brass terms an institutionalized riot system, a systematic pattern of Hindu-Muslim riots that shaped the city more than any other urban center in India. This orchestrated violence strategically targeted all manifestations of Hindu-Muslim co-presence, gradually birthing a segregated social order that would earn Ahmedabad the dubious honor of India's most ghettoized city. The Sabarmati River that traverses Ahmedabad came to act as a material dividing line between prosperous Hindu areas to its west and downtrodden Muslim areas to its east. The system of violence reached its apex under Modi's chief ministership in 2002, when the BJP state government orchestrated independent India's single most damaging episode of Hindu-Muslim violence to date. The resulting backlash against Modi was particularly severe because the violence was now directly associated with state power. It could no longer be disavowed by claiming it emerged from spontaneous outbursts or unconnected groups. The backlash significantly imperiled his lofty political ambitions, including legal inquiries at home and visa bans from foreign governments, including the US. It also endangered his relationship with business elites and middle-class constituents, whose support very much rested on the government's ability to attract capital investment to Gujarat. These tensions previewed what we see today, the inherent difficulties of wielding overt violence while holding state power. Modi's experience in post-2002 Gujarat revealed the need to transform rather than just abandon violence. His subsequent pivot to development, becoming Gujarat's Vikas Purush, which directly translates to development man, proved remarkably successful precisely because it offered a way to sublimate violence into technocratic, depoliticized processes. In the aftermath of 2002 then, Modi pivoted away from his and the BJP's public perception as instigators of violence, of those capable of meeting the imperatives of neoliberalization head-on. The Sabarmati Riverfront Project became the centerpiece of this transformation, exemplifying how cultural violence could be sublimated into the seemingly neutral language of development and progress. So shortly after the 2002 violence, the Modi government forcefully asserted control over this world-class infrastructure and beautification project. In the decade that followed, the project violently evicted 40,000 lower-caste Hindu and Muslim laborers from the heart of Ahmedabad, many of whom had been targets of the 2002 pogrom, to make way for a concrete pier lined with parks, hotels, and luxury apartments. The project provoked a decade-long struggle over resettlement and rehabilitation that culminated in exceedingly violent evictions. Approximately 14,000 of those displaced laborers were eventually resettled to 18 housing projects, several located on abandoned textile mill grounds at the margins of the city. Through this process of violent dispossession and resettlement, the riverbed's former inhabitants were forced into walled, ethnically segregated ghettos that became productively integrated into Ahmedabad's hegemonic spatial order. Now, numerous high-profile voices among India's liberal intelligentsia at the time interpreted Modi's turn to development as evidence of his transformation into an efficient and pragmatic statesman. In the absence of large-scale riots since 2002, and guided by the assumption that participation in the globalized economy and national politics would act as a moderating force, these commentators deemed him fit for India's highest office. Now here you can see what the banks of the Sabarmati looked like before eviction. Here are the resettlement sites, which I'll talk about later. And this is how the riverfront presents now as a sanitized space of erasure, as I call it. Now, existing scholarship on the Riverfront Project, like studies of development-induced dispossession elsewhere, has largely reduced its violence to a byproduct of neoliberal governance. Even though many groups, again, as I said, targeted by dispossession or targeted in the 2002 program later became victims of eviction and resettlement, scholars have not explicitly examined the connections between these forms of violence. While prolific writings on Ahmedabad's urban renewal initiatives have explored how their violence was both enabled by and served neoliberal capital, they have not engaged with its broader spatio-temporal dynamics or political implications. This analytical separation, I argue, has two major consequences. First, by treating the Hindu rights riot violence and urban transformation as a mere background to the violence of dispossession, these accounts miss crucial connections. The artificial separation of political riot violence from the economico-juridical violence of dispossession has inadvertently aided Modi and the Hindu right in shielding themselves from collective reprisals against their use of violence. Second, while these works emphasize the agency of groups struggling over land, this attention to agency abruptly ends once a project of accumulation by dispossession is completed. The evicted are then tacitly relegated to an ever-growing surplus population, rendered insignificant not only to the neoliberal economy, but also to ongoing processes of social, cultural, and political change. In much of the literature, then, violence and agency remain spatially and temporally isolated from the act of dispossession itself, which is immediately legitimated by the economico-juridical order it helps create. The sublimations of violence into development become most visible, I argue, at urban frontiers, where its unmediated forms still appear. Informal settlers have historically served as unlikely architects of urban expansion in India, with landless rural migrants occupying derelict wastelands outside city limits, often with tacit government approval. These urban pioneers helped authorities identify new territories of potential value and inherent risk. By creating basic infrastructure, they both primed areas for capitalist extraction and marked them as so-called problem spaces requiring formal governance. The cycle of demolition and securitization inevitably pushed displaced settlers towards new wastelands awaiting violent incorporation, creating an essential cycle. Now, urban development frontiers emerge in this ruptured time space between the discovery of informal settlements as problem spaces and their incorporation into the hegemonic order. Here, different modalities of capital's violence intersect and become visible, while the center maintains power through the mute compulsion of economic relations. The frontier's volatility requires new rounds of overt violence that expose the coercion underlying seemingly neutral market arrangements. These frontiers, exempt from established hierarchies and procedures, become zones where experimental forms of control are tested. In Modi's India, urban frontiers have become sites where communal and infrastructural violence converge in novel ways. Under communal capitalism, ethno-territorial imperatives actively shape and sometimes override market logics. The placement of resettlement colonies, selection of beneficiaries, and spatial reorganization now advance Hindu nationalist visions of spatial ordering, even when contradicting market optimal land use. Legal ambiguity, previously serving capital accumulation, is weaponized specifically against religious minorities, creating differential zones of citizenship and incorporation. These spaces thus function as double frontiers, not just sites of accumulation, but laboratories where ethno-territorial boundary making is perfected. Violence operates as a system of differential incorporation, where physical and infrastructural violence work together to maintain patterns of inclusion and exclusion that transcend market logic. Yet precisely because frontier spaces make these connections visible, they also reveal potential vulnerabilities to emerging hegemonic formations. When the orchestrated nature of displacement becomes apparent, or when development's supposedly neutral logic reveals its communal imperatives, it might create openings for collective resistance. Now, if urban frontiers are where different modalities of violence become visible, then methodologically tracing these connections requires following those who navigate these spaces across time and space. To understand how violence transforms and connects at these double frontiers, I conducted a multi-sided ethnography following the movements, relations, and practices of those who experience these changing forms of violence firsthand. My research traces backwards from the Muslim and lower caste Hindu communities resettled in 2012, following their history from their initial settlement on the Sabarmati banks in the early 20th century, through their dispossession and resettlement to their present circumstances. This longue durée perspective reveals how the riverbed functioned as a key frontier space long before the Riverfront Project's evictions, a site where the, So by following these communities, we can see hidden spatial temporal mechanisms to which cascading forms of violence established Ahmedabad's segregated spatial order and fueled the Hindu rights rise. I'll skip this. Okay. So now I turn to how this analysis unfolds across this dissertation's chapters. Each chapter illuminates different aspects of how frontier making operates as a system of differential incorporation, while together they reveal the evolution of communal capitalism's laboratory in Gujarat. So chapter 2, Ahmedabad's long 20th century, as I said, traces the making of Ahmedabad's segregated spatial order. I map an alternative history of violence and urban change centered on previously overlooked informal settlers at the Sabarmati riverbank. As I mentioned earlier, the banks of the Sabarmati are usually framed as empty spaces in conventional histories, despite being sites of working class and anti-colonial struggles since Gandhi moved his ashram there in 1917. Through this historical analysis, I demonstrate how the Sangh Parivars, or the Hindu rights hegemonic project, operated through a system that hinged on the erection of mobile political frontiers. Building on Ernesto Laclau, who talks about how political frontiers operate discursively to divide the people into antagonistic camps, I show how the Hindu rights orchestrated violence transformed these frontiers from purely discursive constructs into material borders with specific spatio-temporal properties. These borders operated through distinct but interrelated mechanisms. Mosaic-like frontiers that segregated lower caste Hindus and Muslims in economically deprived localities, and sanitized frontiers that sequestered elite Hindus in the Western Ahmedabad while maintaining violence from a distance. They function as dynamic zones that stored and released violence across time and space, allowing its effects to echo beyond immediate locations and durably shape urban morphology. The power of these frontiers lay not simply in their exclusionary function, but in their productive capacity to shape Muslim spatial practices and identities in ways that became integral to the hegemonic spatial order itself. By simultaneously constraining and channeling Muslim agency through particular spatial arrangements, these frontiers generated forms of Muslim presence that were essential to mobilizing both elite and subordinate Hindu groups, even as this necessary incorporation created possibilities for forms of agency that exceeded the system's careful management. So rather than erasing Muslims, right, violence created borders that mobilized Hindus against Muslims, maintaining a selective presence. But through maintaining this presence, ironically, it created spaces where Muslims, in particular spaces like the riverbed, were able to gain a certain level of power and influence, right? So I demonstrate these dynamics through two contrasting cases. At the riverbed, the unique materiality, the slope of the regularly flooded lower-lying areas during monsoon season, combined with expanding informal land markets to created unusual social hierarchies. Muslim intermediaries, so-called leaders called agyavans, gained significant power by brokering land to vulnerable populations, particularly lower caste Hindu migrants who couldn't find work or lost livelihoods during the textile industry's collapse between the 60s and 1980s. As the riverbed's population swelled to over 50,000, these agyavans developed a sophisticated patronage system based on parallel market for land and votes, maintaining mixed Hindu-Muslim socialities while generating forms of political influence that openly contravened the city's increasingly rigid segregation. The system proved remarkably resilient throughout the second half of the 20th century. Neither the Hindu rights attempt to instigate violence, communal violence throughout the 80s and 90s, nor the Congress-led municipal corporation attempted evictions through riverfront modernization plans in the 60s and 70s could dislodge these groups. Even when the latest riverfront development plans were formalized in the late 90s, the agyavans effectively mobilized settlers to resist initial surveys, demonstrating how spaces of Muslim agency could challenge incorporation into the hegemonic spatial order. Now, Juhapura's trajectory reveals the opposite dynamic. It's deeply connected to the riverfront because it was created in 1973 as a resettlement site for flood-displaced riverbed residents. Johapura then, down the line, would become known as India's largest Muslim ghetto following the communal violence of the 1980s and 90s, now counting up to, I think, 750,000 Muslims in one particular area. As Muslims from across Ahmedabad were forced to flee mixed neighborhoods, seeking refuge from targeted violence, Johapura emerged as the city's primary Muslim area, development that reflected and further entrenched Ahmedabad's segregated spatial order. Cut off from the riverbed's protective patronage networks, the area became subject to traveling frontiers of violence that fixed Hindu-Muslim antagonism while generating performances of violence that traveled beyond their immediate context. The construction of a literal wall between Juhapura and the Hindu majority Vijaypur next to it exemplifies how political frontiers materialized into self-reinforcing cycles of segregation that shaped both urban space and hegemonic meaning. So understanding these interrelated spatial dynamics proves crucial for grasping how Modi's post-2002 development agenda would later systematize these techniques through the Sabarmati Riverfront Project, as I will now show. Now, Chapter 3, A Perfect Storm, examines how Modi transformed frontier-making violence during his chief ministership by actively conjoining the logics of communal and capitalist violence. While previously, the Hindu right and the Congress government wielded political and capitalist frontier-making violences separately, Modi's post-2002 development agenda actively produced new double frontiers through their coordinated deployment under a single hegemonic logic. This transformation emerged from a fundamental crisis facing the BJP after assuming state power. The persistence of mixed settlements along the Sabarmati, protected by the Muslim Agyaban's patronage system, continued to challenge carefully constructed geographies of segregation. While the 2002 pogrom initially targeted these localities, the strategy proved self-defeating. Not only did the settlers defiantly return, but wielding hegemonic violence through state institutions had exposed the actors behind it, generating political backlash, as I mentioned before. The Riverfront Project became a crucial laboratory for resolving this. Having gained outsized control over the state apparatus after 2002, Modi took Riverfront implementation into his own hands using three key mechanisms. First, Modi retooled the Congress's neoliberal policies into instruments of planned rather than organic violence. The targeted combination of riot violence and dispossession destroyed the material basis of the patronage systems that had sustained Muslim Agyabans. Second, this created a new market for land, votes, and this time, communal antagonism. Rather than resisting, as in previous decades, Agyabans seized control over resettlement allotment lists, colluding with officials to extort inhabitants while collaborating with staff to instigate Hindu-Muslim conflicts and thereby advance the process of dispossession and resettlement. Third, the transformed Agyavans that had once formed bulwarks against violence now became transformed. Their practices, from orchestrating targeted violence to weaponizing document requirements along religious lines, succeeded where decades of previous attempts had failed, removing the dangerous classes from the city center while erasing the political possibilities their resistance had represented. This marked the birth of communal capitalist hegemony, where Modi resolved the BJP's fundamental crisis by transforming riot violence into the violence of dispossession, a form that fulfilled the same urgent need within the Hindu rights hegemonic project, while no longer appearing as violent to the public. The Agyabans then became what Enzo Paci calls masks, through which both capital and communal violence could operate. Their intimate knowledge of community dynamics, once used to resist communal attacks, was repurposed to identify vulnerabilities for targeted displacement. They became abstract intermediaries who could simultaneously advance spatial segregation while translating Hindu nationalist hegemony into everyday practices. This transformation success is most visible in the riverfront's physical and discursive reconstitution. By 2016, the complex politics of violence, resistance, and agency that had defined the riverbed localities were literally and figuratively erased, replaced by a sanitized urban space that obscures its violent production. Most middle-class Ahmedabadis remained unaware of the resettlement site's existence, seeing only a peaceful and modern utopia credited directly to Modi. While the Riverfront Project appears to have perfectly erased any trace of violence that created it, examining the city's resettlement sites reveals a deeper truth. The nexus of violence and hegemony was not eliminated, but deliberately transported to spaces outside the middle-class public's view. In Chapter 4, Excessive Agency at the Double Frontier, I examine how Modi's development agenda spatially relocated the violence of dispossession. These resettlement sites exist not as separate spaces, but as the riverfront's violent other, materially and socially bound to the center through circuits of displacement and control. While Hindu middle-class residents stroll through sanitized parks and regulated promenades at the center, frontier-making violence operates with renewed intensity at the periphery. Two faces of the same spatial order, dialectically linked and imminently producing one another. Now, India's authoritarian turn since 2019 marks a crucial transformation in how these spatial politics operate. The introduction of the Citizenship Amendment Act and proposed National Register of Citizens signaled a fundamental shift from Modi's earlier strategy of combining Hindu nationalism with development discourse, where the post-2002 period maintained a delicate balance, allowing certain forms of controlled Muslim agency while advancing Hindu nationalist goals. The post-2019 era represents an unraveling of this arrangement. The facade of inclusive development has given way to more direct forms of exclusion and control, most visible in the systemic targeting of Muslim political expression during the anti-CAA protests and their aftermath. So unlike earlier chapters that trace the present through the past or national conjunctural shifts through historical engagement with Ahmedabad as a window into these shifts, this chapter approaches the current conjuncture directly through resettlement sites as urban frontiers. Through this analysis, I demonstrate how these spaces, again, serve as laboratories. I feel I repeat myself. So the transformation of double frontiers manifests directly across multiple sites, each illustrating not just a different phase, but a different temporality of India's authoritarian turn. Vatva, which you could see on a picture earlier, demonstrates how the organic segregation that emerged in Juhapura through decades of communal violence has been systematized into an accelerated, engineered form of spatial control. Through sophisticated forms of infrastructural violence and a reconstituted Agyavan nexus colluding with municipal corporators, it provides a template for expedited communal segregation. The settlement's division into a Hindustan and Pakistan bloc represents something more deliberate than Juhapura's gradual transformation. The state-directed reproduction of political frontiers as material borders, now accomplished through institutional design rather than quote-unquote organic evolution. However, it is the Ajit Mills resettlement site that offers perhaps the most revealing window into how Modi's communal capitalist hegemony evolved. Unlike peripheral sites like Vatva, Ajit Mills occupies a distinctive position in Rakia, a Muslim-majority area unusually well connected to transport and economic opportunities. The site directly faces what locals call the Beverly Hills for Muslims, an area of upper-class Muslim homes that initially made Ajit Mills appear as a success story of Muslim upward mobility through resettlement. Here you can see an image of the middle-class homes facing the resettlement site. This apparent success masked a sophisticated system of controlled Muslim agency under the authority of Muhammad Sharif, or Sharif Bhai, a prominent former anti-displacement leader co-opted by the state. Through his position as the Resident Welfare Association president, Sharif Bhai constructed an elaborate power structure, controlling roughly a third of the 700 housing units directly and another 50 to 100 through associates, maintaining strategic vacancies for exploitative rental schemes targeting vulnerable populations, and installing CCTV systems feeding directly to his apartment for comprehensive surveillance. Here you can see Sharif Bhai in his resettlement apartment and the CCTV feed into his apartment. So Sharif Bhai's authority operated through multiple vectors of control. In his official capacity as the Resident Welfare Association's president, he became gatekeeper for outside donor funds and basic services, strategically distributing resources along caste and religious lines to deepen internal divisions. His monopoly over protection services against police raids, combined with his role as ultimate conflict mediator to created a perpetually desperate and acquiescent population in the resettlement site itself. The constant influx of new strangers through his rental schemes prevented the formation of stable communities, fostering distrust not only between Hindu and Muslim residents, but among Muslim caste groups themselves. However, what made Ajit Mills particularly significant was how it revealed a delicate balance in Muslim political agency permitted under communal capitalism before 2019. Sharif Bhai's concentrated power was tolerated precisely because it was contained within a Muslim area and expressed through criminal enterprise, actually reinforcing rather than challenging Hindutva narratives about Muslim spaces. His collaboration with Congress corporator Amjad Pathan maintained political acquiescence through calculated carrot and stick tactics, while management of internal divisions prevented the emergence of unified Muslim political action. Through the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act, this ruptured this careful equilibrium. Sharif Bhai's transformation from co-opted intermediary to protest facilitator, using his control over Ajit Mills to host Shaheen Bagh demonstrations, marked a decisive break. So Shaheen Bagh, for context, was the women-led protest movement associated with Delhi that followed the imposition of the Citizenship Amendment Act. And Sharif Bhai, interestingly, became the leader of this, 5 more minutes, okay. Of this very movement from the resettlement site itself. So between January and March 2020, the site became a crucial node in unprecedented nationwide protests, hosting activists, academics, and political representatives for sit-ins and speeches. Through Sharif Bhai's unilaterally imposed role of this role on reluctant residents, the very fact that he provided space for political mobilization signaled the collapse of previous arrangements of controlled Muslim agency. The state's response was swift and decisive. COVID-19 restrictions in March 2020 provided cover for establishing permanent police presence inside the settlement, which you can see here, intensifying surveillance and systematically dismantling autonomous Muslim authority. Sharif Bhai's subsequent shift from Congress connections to supporting AIMIM, a Muslim political party, in 2021, marked his irreversible transformation from co-opted intermediary to political opposition, a trajectory that exemplifies broader shifts in how the Hindu nationalist state now approaches Muslim authority. Here you can also see the abandoned stage of the Shaheen Bagh sit-in protests after the imposition of more repressive tactics following the pandemic. So in these peripheral locations, violence breaks free of its unneeded form, exposing the ongoing politics of communal capitalist hegemony during India's authoritarian turn. I feel like I've said. This dissertation, in the end, demonstrates how Ahmedabad's urban frontiers serve as portals into understanding broader transformations in India's hegemonic power structures. By examining these spaces across space and time, we see how different forms of violence, from communal rise to development, intersect and evolve, becoming most visible at these frontiers. Now, India's authoritarian turn marks a fundamental rupture in this pattern. The rubber band connecting Hindu nationalist violence and articulations of Muslim agency has snapped, right? The careful balance maintained under communal capitalism has given way to more direct forms of repression. We see this most clearly in the bulldozer politics that now openly targets Muslims-owned businesses, no longer bothering to mask violence behind development discourse. I mean, these bulldozer politics are officially legitimated through these economic or juridical discourses, but both opponents and adherents or supporters of bulldozer politics very much realize that this is a very flimsy facade. So it seems to me as though Muslim agency is no longer being maintained and managed, but systematically eliminated as India moves towards a more explicit apartheid state. But as I said earlier, this return to unmediated violence carries its own risks for the Hindu nationalist project. As we saw with recent electoral setbacks, in states where bulldozer politics were most aggressive, naked repression can still generate collective resistance. However, and this is perhaps most troubling, the fundamental terrain of politics itself seems to have shifted. In our current world historical moment of rising authoritarianism, the sublimation of violence may no longer be necessary. From India to the United States, we see growing popular appetite for direct violence against those deemed threats to majority identity and privilege. The careful masks developed during Modi's Gujarat laboratory may no longer be required when significant portions of the population openly welcome violent exclusion. This forces us to rethink not only how hegemonic power operates, but how resistance might emerge. If the delicate balance of differential incorporation has given way to starker choices between radical politics of various kinds, between explicit apartheid and direct confrontation, then again, I think we just have to be mindful of what that means for our present moment. I think I will end here to save us time and look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Shrey. We can open it up for questions and discussion. Shrey, I'll let you field questions or comments that come along, okay?
Yes.
Stephanie has a question. Oh no, Stephanie's just uploading you. Any comments or questions? Wendy, please.
Oh, hi, Wendy.
Hey, Shrey, congratulations. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Really rich. So I appreciated everything that you said. And I guess I want to ask you a couple of questions, maybe to give you a chance to elaborate on some of the research that you did. You did over 100 interviews, and we don't hear as much about that material in the presentation. So I guess the way I want to ask it is, you're talking about communal capitalism and the popular, and I really wanted to understand better what communal meant, where the community was in communal, and I totally understand that communal has a very particular meaning, but still the absence of understanding perceptions, experiences, norms, and sort of what the shape of the popular is. The popular seems to stand in for hegemonic, and yet how that gets constructed through what kind of understandings and what kind of social contract. The presentation is really clear on the sort of spatial manifestation of power, which seems to come primarily and maybe even exclusively from a state-led project that is enacted in certain ways. And I probably missed the sort of detail in some of what you were saying. But I just wanted a bit more elaboration on how people understand, navigate, and engage with this. And I also wanted to question a little bit the sort of understanding of space, and maybe to hear a bit more about your theorization of it. At one point, you sort of suggested that it was impossible to build trust in the settlements because people were new. And there's a sort of way of understanding fixity as essential for building trust and identity, which I think would be challenged by a lot of people. So I wonder about how that just gets back to the way in which people make sense of all of this, and how that builds on prior sort of connections. And understanding this would help me to understand this gentleman who's the one sort of person whom you present, who goes from being a disciplinarian in the resettlement to somehow an organizer of protests. And it wasn't clear to me how he makes this transition. Does he believe different things? How does he come to play this role? Thank you for your talk.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. Lots of great questions, and I'll try to address some of them. But what you raise is an important point, and a difficulty in presenting this kind of work. I had to make a choice in whether on which side of my brain and heart I wanted to show here or present here. The one that shows how incredibly coherent the manifestation of hegemony appears in the current conjuncture as a state-backed project, right? Versus the nuance and lived experience of those groups who engage with it on the ground, right? The ethnographic granularity, so to speak. And I chose the former, obviously, because packing everything into a 45-minute talk would have been quite challenging. So on how these things are experienced, in the dissertation itself, I spent quite a bit of time tracing the construction of not only the meta discourses of neoliberalization, for instance, through the architect of the Sabarmati Riverfront, who I interviewed extensively, and how those discourses then become translated by government actors backed by Modi's takeover of the Riverfront Project, for instance. So there's a lot of that in an experiential aspect of that in the actual dissertation itself. So, and you're right in saying that communal in this particular context is misleading, right? Because communal in the South Asian context specifically refers to Hindu-Muslim violence and antagonism, and not necessarily to community. But of course, the formation of kinship is central to the entire story I'm telling. And I think the point you raise about space and fixity is an important one, because I trace in my second chapter the riverbed as a place of promiscuous social relations throughout the long 20th century, where Hindus and Muslims lived in very specific housing arrangements that were outside or exterior to Ahmedabad's spatial order, right? And this was they needed this time and this exteriority to and this absence of outside surveillance, so to speak, to develop networks of trust and, of course, the power-laden patronage systems that I described. Now, what happened in the resettlement sites is that these groups at times were intentionally resettled in mixed settlement patterns. So Hindus with Muslims, lower caste with upper caste, et cetera, but this time with people they didn't know, they didn't have any prior connection with, right? And so the social disarticulation that happened through resettlement then continued, and so rather than building new networks of trust, the intermediaries that I trace used land markets and their control over land markets to strategically change the social composition of the resettlement sites, right? Renting or evacuating and renting certain housing clusters and introducing new groups there specifically to instigate new forms of conflict. So that's what I meant with the space and lack of fixity argument there. I wonder if you had a broader point about space and fixity that you wanted me to elaborate on, though.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. I think it connects to this feeling of wanting to understand better the construction of the social relationships,
Yeah.
as they seem to be really key for the, for having the hegemonic kind of authority that Modi does. So I think you did a really nice job. And, to think about imagined community, which I know is not adequate, and certainly not adequate in this case, but you don't have to know everybody to feel a sense of kinship or identification, even solidarity, right? That would make a lot of political actions possible, but certain kinds of ties can rise above or under that. And it's interesting that that doesn't happen in some circumstances, and that's what needs to be.
Yeah. And part of the dissertation actually traces many different ways in which that manifests, from or different Hindu-Muslim alliances that are quote unquote allowed to exist in these spaces in the current conjuncture. And unfortunately, a lot of it is very bleak. No, there's a lot of I hate to be sometimes when I think about my own work, it comes across as very structural functionalist in a sense. I understand that this is antithetical to good ethnography, but unfortunately, this is really how I perceived and analyzed these places, as incredibly strongly determined by these broader projects and ongoings, right? And so to me, this hegemonic project and the violences inherent to it constantly create a gravitational field, like a plantation system, that doesn't allow forms of kinship and some kind of collectivity to really emerge. And so in one of my chapters, I discuss a nascent alliance that emerges in one of the resettlement sites, very similar in its exteriority to the riverfront itself during the 20th century, that eventually, through various mechanisms, in particular town planning schemes, becomes incorporated or disarticulated once again. So I really try to show how these different scales connect with one another, and how real living individuals engage with it. Unfortunately, in conveying this, what shines through is the coherence of the project that makes it.
Thanks, Shrey. There's so much to say there, but other people should ask questions, and I'm afraid I have to hop off at 11, but it's great to see you. Congratulations.
Great to see you too. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question?
Hopefully.
Or do we have to end in 1 minute?
I don't know, I'm not in control of this whole thing. But hi, Kendra. Yes.
Hello, congratulations. Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. It's so great to see this come to fruition in such amazing ways. It's been a journey getting here, I know, and it's just incredible to see all of the rich and detailed work that went into this. I kind of wanted to pick up this question, though, of thinking about the spatial character of resettlement in this specific site in Gujarat. And if you can speak a little bit more about how this site might be distinct, or its connections to other parts of the country, especially in thinking about the Citizenship Amendment Act, and a lot of the mobilization around that, and this kind of double-edged sword that you hint at. And I think Wendy's questions kind of get at this as well, that there's sort of this, at the same time that there's this very challenging and deeply disturbing and problematic new spatial arrangement that's emerged, it's also created a potential pathway for very concentrated mobilizing and organizing. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how this is different than other parts of the country, and how you see this unfolding at a national scale, and maybe some of the regional differences too, especially in thinking about how the questions of citizenship play out in the Northeast in different ways than in Gujarat, and how you see this unfolding in the present moment.
Thanks, Brandon. That's an excellent question. So the argument that I make in the dissertation is that Ahmedabad is somewhat of a conjunctural palimpsest, that it prefigures national developments as a laboratory in a sense. And I obviously didn't, I knew Ahmedabad was crucial given that Modi was chief minister there before he became prime minister, et cetera. But it's staggering how these things are now unfolding at national scale incredibly rapidly. And we just finished a special issue for Antipode on communal capitalism, actually, where this question is actually addressed in analyzing these dynamics across different Indian cities. And as I said, so we look at places like Kashmir, like Faizabad, Ayodhya, where the Ram Temple was just inaugurated, Calcutta, et cetera, an arrangement of different cities. And so what makes Ahmedabad unique is because it's the most intense version of this, right? And this has to do with pre-colonial history and all kinds of ways in which socialities were circumscribed even before the Hindu right emerged, right? With traditional housing arrangements, et cetera, et cetera. But we can see now in real time and how this mode of spatial ordering is taking shape in other cities as we speak, right? If we talk about Faizabad, Ayodhya, for instance, again, this is the home of the historic temple dispute in India, where a Muslim masjid was destroyed in 1992, creating riots, and now the Hindu temple on its site was constructed. And with the reconstruction of this Hindu temple, wholesale redevelopment of Ayodhya, Faizabad is occurring exactly along the same lines as we had seen in Ahmedabad and in the resettlement sites themselves. So to put it in a nutshell, we see this process occurring nationally at a breakneck pace in a coherence unseen before, I think, backed by state power in a way that we hadn't seen before. And honestly, resistance, right? I had talked, so one of the authors of the special issue writes about Faizabad. She's a Muslim woman experiencing these things, and she balks at the idea of agency of resistance, right? All people are really experiencing, feeling, sensing at this moment is loss. So it's very hard to find, these ruptures or these massive mobilizations at the moment, because honestly, they simply don't exist. Or that's too strong of a statement. They are very, very difficult to find.
Thanks for that.
Thank
And
you.
congrats again.
I mean, if other people wish to join, pose questions or make comments, there's nothing to restrict us, I think. So. Well, I guess we should all thank Shrey and congratulate him again for a wonderful job, and wish him all the best as he moves forward. We'll all look forward to seeing you in May as well, Shrey.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks everyone for joining. It's been a real pleasure, and yeah, I hope we can discuss this stuff when we see each other, and hopefully also other things. And yeah, see you all soon.
Okay,
Great
thank
job,
you.
Shrey.